Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about this little thing called cause and effect. And so I'm going to do it in two ways. One, I'm going to talk about why cause and effect is so important in our play with children in terms of their development and how what our expectations are can sort of be a mismatch for where they are and then therefore lead to not promoting inclusive practices. And then I wanted to talk about cause and effect in the adult realm, meaning how do we cause the desired effect to get someone to believe the way that we believe or to implement inclusive practices. So I'm going to do it two ways, talk about it from a developmental perspective and why cause and effect can lead to more inclusive environments for children. And then how do we deal with when we want to cause an effect in an adult who doesn't quite buy into our passion, or as my friend Kristen said this morning, they don't see the gift that inclusion is. So let's start with developmentally, and then let's move to the harder stuff, which is what to do about cause and effect in an adult, right? It's often easier to cause and effect in children. So this aha came to me and my colleagues when I was in Des Moines last spring, and we started really looking at circle time. And many of you know that I have strong opinions about circle time, and that's another story. But we were looking at these children in these inclusive classrooms, and we were saying, what's up? Like, how can we make circle time a way for all children to be involved? Because we saw, the kind of the group, and then we saw one or two kids that were on IEPs with a shadow doing like a mini one-on-one circle in the back of the circle, on the side of the circle, trying to keep the kid in the circle. And we said, like what is really mismatched when you want to build community and you want all children to come to circle time? How could we look at that in a different way? And so then people were like, well, let them play with something or fidget with something. But when you break it down, what the children were really saying was, I'm not yet ready for symbolic play. And so much of circle time and a preschool classroom is just entrenched in symbolism. And symbolism, which is really interesting, parallels in development with cognition and language. So if you have a kid with a cognitive delay or a language delay, that's why they're on an IEP almost across the board, then that means that their symbolic play is going to be delayed. So symbolism or symbolic play, cognition, and language all run three tracks in development. And so if you're struggling with cognition or language, highly likely that you're also struggling with symbolic play. And a prerequisite of symbolic play is the functional use of objects. And a prerequisite of the functional use of objects is to be able to act upon objects in an intentional way to cause some sort of effect. So we call this cause and effect. So backing it up to that circle time where children were struggling, particularly children that had cognitive delays and language delays, but were in an inclusive classroom, when we looked at that circle time, just giving them a fidget toy or giving them a book to hold while circle was going wasn't really getting at the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was that the circle time was highly symbolic, highly cognitive, and highly language based. And what we needed to pare back was to address cause and effect. There needed to be cause and effect opportunities during the activity. So I'm going to give you three ways that you can embed more cause and effect opportunities across the daily routine and therefore promote inclusive practices, because you'll be in that sweet spot, right? That zone of proximal development, or what I call the Goldilocks, right? It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. So for some kids, what's just right is cause and effect, not functional use, not representational play, not symbolic play, certainly not cooperative play that's hugely grounded in language, cognition, and symbolic representation, because those are three parallel tracks, right? So if any one of those tracks is off, we need to come back to what is our what that will really promote a child's inclusion. So the three ways you can think about cause and effect with toys, you can think of cause and effect with interactions, and you can think of cause and effect with communication. And I'll post to our Facebook group a data collection form that I made for a colleague in Iowa that looked at, if you care about cause and effect with toys or materials, How would you monitor the measurement of that if you were looking at cause and effect between interactions and cause and effect with communication? And I'll just stick on the cause and effect with objects right now because that's the most concrete. And then you can start to think about, what does cause and effect mean when it comes to interactions, right, between us and children, between children and other children, and then our use of expressive language to get some sort of effect. And then we'll shift gears over to causing an effect in our adult friends who we want to embrace this gift of inclusion. So just quickly about the cause and effect for interaction with objects. The first thing is to sort of understand what is your what. And so I'm going to read this to you so that you can kind of capture it. And then again, I'll post it in print and you can look at it. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's taking an action to make something happen. So cause and effect is when children take an intentional action to intentionally make something happen. Earlier in development, they'll do simple motor actions quite repeatedly. We call them dumpers, right? Kids that just kind of flit around and like dump things out or pour things out or pat things repeatedly or drop things or swipe things. Those are all necessary as well. So you might have kids that are not yet even ready for cause and effect. But let's just stay here and say that they're consciously able, that means that prefrontal cortex is really firing and they're able to think about, what do I want to do to cause some sort of effect on a toy? And so at that circle time, what we need are cause and effect materials. And then if you can get more sophisticated, cause and effect interactions. And then if they're ready for it from a language perspective, cause and effect language. So anything that is that progressive ing, that patting, banging, swiping, poking, dumping, pushing, pulling, all of those great things are a cause and effect kind of verb. And so you want to think about, do I have materials where children can intentionally take some action to cause the intended effect? So do a quick clean sweep of your activities in a preschool classroom and just notice, are there opportunities for cause and effect interaction with toys and objects? Then you can up the ante and say, are there opportunities for cause and effect interactions socially? And then you can up it one more level and say, are there cause and effect opportunities from communication? So that's your first of 2 tips today that is really looking at cause and effect in being able to promote inclusive practices. And we really say to ourselves that when children are struggling with highly symbolic, highly cognitive based, and highly language based activities and expectations, we're creating an artificial barrier to them being fully included. That can be at whole group time, small group time. It can even be during play. So you want to do that clean sweep of the whole routine to figure out, are there enough opportunities for children to have cause and effect interactions with objects, one another in terms of peers and us, and then with language. Okay, now to the harder one. So my good friend Libby posted a question which caused me to have shark music. Just in case any of you are under the illusion that I have any of this figured out, I'm going to show you right now, I don't. So she posted to our Facebook about some colleagues and some of her staff who don't see inclusion as a gift. And that's causing her shark music. And so then she asked me, do you have some advice? And then I heard shark music, which meant I went straight to my basement brain and I had a really snarky comment. So speaking to my friends in Iowa, whenever we feel snarky and we hear shark music and people won't drink our Kool-Aid, we're always wanting to say, there's a job opening at Clinique, right? That is such a basement brain response. No empathy, no compassion, no problem solving, right? I went straight to my basement brain and said, well, if you don't like inclusion, why don't you get a job over at Clinique? They're hiring, right? So that lets me know that I am in my basement brain. So if you're having that same flood of emotion when a colleague says something to you about children with disabilities, like, why are they included? Why do they have to be in this classroom? Aren't they going to just like ruin it for everybody? Know that those are more than likely going to trigger you to have a very basement brain response like me, right? So if you have that kind of flushed with emotion, you're like, what's wrong with you? And you're making that face, you're probably in your basement brain. So don't take any action, right? You're on the red train. And that person might also be on the red train. And so what I started to do was think, okay, how can I help Libby? How can I help any of us who face people who won't take our cause and get to the desired effect, right? That they won't help us promote inclusive practices. Like, we've been together for 3 weeks and I've been throwing all these tips at you, and you're like, yes, if I were the ruler of the world, of course these tips would work. But I have resistance. So if you're like me and that resistance caused the shark music, and the shark music caused you to go to your basement brain and have a snarky response, maybe you need to do some self-reflection. So I tried that. So I got out my journal and I said, okay, which superpower can I promote to figure out a solution? So I picked compassion. And so I didn't feel compassionate, right? I heard shark music when Libby asked this question. And I wanted these people to like stop interacting with children and go work at Clinique, because if you don't love them like I do, you have no business being here. So I said to myself, so I'm going to not read to you my journal entry, but I'm going to tell you kind of how I got out of the basement brain and got up into my prefrontal cortex. And then I'm not going to give you the answer, because the answer is, and Libby knows this, is through self-reflection, self-awareness, and asking ourselves these really hard questions. And then through that, asking ourselves these hard questions, we can find an answer. So as I tried to get out of the basement brain, I tried to pull my left hemisphere into action. That's always my go-to, right? Like if I'm feeling snarky, then be very analytical, which is really kind of the worst thing to do, because even for children to get off the red train, I often say, you get out of the red train or out of the red zone by way of your right hemisphere. So what I tried to do was problem solve. I wanted to brainstorm, like, why are these the barriers? What have you already tried with this person? What is their resistance? What is at the root of it? So this like left hemisphere wanted to be very logical and language based and linear and make my list and go, okay, here's how the problem is and here's how we can solve it. I was like, well, that's not going to be it either. So then I thought, okay, I got to use my right hemisphere. Let me just breathe for a minute, try to relax my nervous system so I'm not so anxious about the shark music. Okay, what is the cause of the problem? Or what is the cause that I'm trying to create? What is the intentional action that I want? And what is the effect? And so what I was thinking to myself was that I don't really have control over the other person's thoughts and behaviors and beliefs. That makes me mad, right? I want to control that. I want you to believe what I believe, right? That I, Peter Pan, believe in the gifts of all children. Why don't you? So I thought, okay, what do I have really control over? What can I influence? And then what do I have to let go of for right now? And so I always use that phrase, for right now, because if I say, I don't have any control over it, it's too bad, that just makes me feel like I'm giving up, and then the sharks come back. So I say, for right now. So I thought to myself, okay, the superpower I was trying to reflect on was compassion. What can I control right now? And I thought, well, maybe I can control like how I'm seeing the situation. One of our colleagues that's on live today talked about a person who had a lot of resistance as passionate resistance, right? And it was like, yes, like almost trying to look at it as that person's gift, that they were very passionately against my ideas. But it was like, okay, these are some questions that I can ask myself to have control over how I see the situation. So I just wrote them down. What lesson is there for me to learn from this? This is a hard one for me, but oftentimes I have to remind myself that when I face resistance or a barrier, there's really a lesson for me to be learned, not for me to teach that person a lesson. And don't get me wrong, I want to teach that person the way, but rather, what can I learn? What can I have control over? What can I see with more compassion? Why was this such a trigger for me? Why did I go, get a job at Clinique then, right? Like, why did I not have any compassion for this person and feel like they didn't deserve any of my love and attention, and certainly did not deserve to be with children? And then really, what is the ideal outcome? Sometimes we think what I want is this person to drink my Kool-Aid and be passionate about inclusion. Is there yet maybe a middle ground of an ideal situation, not asking the person to go work at Clinique, not getting them all the way to where we are, but ideally right now Is there a place we can move towards? And when I start to think about that ideal place, I can start to step backwards and say, okay, ideally, where can we get this year? Ideally, where can I get by the next staff meeting? Ideally, where can I get by Monday when kids are going to be here, right? So I'm going to think about how can I be more compassionate towards that person to understand what has happened in their past to make them not so tolerant and not to see the gift of inclusion. Do I understand where they've come from? Do I understand how others maybe have rejected them? So again, what are the lessons that I can learn? What is the ideal place I can go? And then what have I done to model compassion? What have I done to model for my staff that we are all different and that we are all loved for the differences by which we bring? Have I been promoting compliance over compassion? Have I been promoting standardization over personalization? Have I really been walking the walk to let them know that they're going to be safe and fine and that they won't get a bad evaluation because they have those kids in their classroom, right? So again, this was kind of a journey over several days once Libby posted it. But when I looked at her post and her question about why don't other adults see the value of inclusion? How can I get them to see the value? I started to think about cause and effect, right? I want to take an intentional action that has the effect of you, Peter Pan believing the way that I believe. And so I had to really step back, get out of my basement brain, try to do that by way of my right hemisphere, and really think about compassion. And compassion only occurs upstairs brain, prefrontal cortex part of my whole system. And so how can I be more compassionate? So I offered a set of questions that we can reflect on and start to really understand what was our trigger, what could have happened in this person's life that they have not seen the way that I see things. How can I model compassion? So Libby, if you're watching back, you know that these are not answers or advice, but you also know from our mastermind experience that so much of this is really inner work, our opportunity to say, what's the lesson here for me? What can I think differently? And what is the ideal outcome that I'm in search of so that I can begin to take baby steps towards what I have control over and what I can influence versus what do I not have control over right now. So that is today's Facebook Live. How does cause and effect allow us to promote inclusive practices? So where I started it, for those of you who are just jumping on, or those of you who didn't really pay attention to the first part, I was talking about how cause and effect in development is a missing ingredient to most classroom routines that are creating artificial gaps to children being able to fully access, participate, and make progress. And that developmentally, symbolic play, cognition, and language happen concurrently in concurrent tracks. And so if those are delayed, which most of our kids on IEPs are going to be, we have to look at what comes earlier. And what comes earlier, in particular around symbolism, and then in interactions, and then in expressive language, is this idea of cause and effect. This intentional action to create some intentional outcome. And so I talked about intentionally cause and effect with objects and toys. And then I'll post it to our Facebook. What does that look like in terms of interactions? And what does that look like in terms of communication? And then lastly, we just heard a little shark music when we think about the resistance that some of our colleagues can share or our staff members can present when they don't see inclusion as the way. And so how can we create some intentional action that leads to some intentional outcome when it comes to resistance? So I hope this was helpful. This is our last Facebook Live for this little pop-up group. Make sure that you've signed up to get the summaries at a glance so you don't have to come back and dig for them and you can process them over time. And we'll leave the group open for a few more days. If you have questions or concerns or want to share with others what inclusion looks like in your neck of the woods, that would be my gratitude and my request of you, if you haven't already, is to post on Facebook, what does inclusion look like in your neck of the woods? That helps all of us kind of turn down the shark music and go, Nobody has this figured out yet, but together we can find a way. So thank you for spending some of your Saturday live with me. Any of you who are watching back afterwards, thank you so much. And we will talk soon.